Hi, let's continue with the sensory pathway. So over here, let's take a look at the antero and lateral or spinal thalamic pathway. So over here, if you see from you have receptors for pain or cold, for instance, those that senses all these different sensations, and they will send the message to the first order neuron. Okay, and don't forget, it travels through the posterior root ganglion. Now we call it the anterolateral because it doesn't go through the posterior column of the spinal cord, but it goes through right in the frontal region of it. So now right over here, they meet what we call the secondary neuron, the second order neuron. So right over here, as it passes through the medulla, passes through the midbrain, and reaches all the way to the thalamus. Okay, so remember our thalamus is a relay center, and that's where they meet the third order neuron. And the third order neuron will carry the message from the thalamus all the way to the cerebral cortex. All right, so I hope you see this general theme as information comes in, and through three of these neurons, eventually they will reach their destination. Now let's take a look at the trigeminal thalamic pathway. So remember your trigeminal nerves? Right, so they receive messages and they are receptors that respond to touch, etc. Now where they receive the messages from are mainly in the face or regions, facial region, nasal cavity, oral cavity, etc. So this is where you have your first order neuron traveling in, and they meet the second order neuron and relay all the message through the trigeminal thalamic tract all the way up and to the thalamus, and they meet the third order neuron and send a message to the cerebral cortex of where they are supposed to be sending it to. Okay, so I hope you do see if you know your first, second, third order neurons, and you will be able to find where their destination should be at. And a lot of them have the similar pattern. So over here is the table 16.3. So you can take a look at these tracks as well as it summarizes the function of it. Now over here, we can see the trigeminal thalamic tract as well as, remember we drew a line between the first three and this last one because this one goes to the cerebellum. Okay. So for instance, so they carry impulses, for instance, in trunk as well as the lower limb on one side of the body to the same side of the cerebellum. Okay. Now let's take a look at our sensory homunculus and as it corresponds to regions that receive information from your sensory neurons, the sensory neuron. So do you remember it was evenly distributed or not evenly distributed? Right. Remember, for instance, even though our upper and lower trunk takes up a large portion of the body mass, but they don't have a lot of somatosensory neurons compared to regions of your finger, hands versus your face, especially your oral regions like the lips. So they are not distributed evenly in the body. Okay. Now, so how about our somatic motor pathway? Now, do you remember, are these, for instance, um, ascending all the way to the top, or they have processed the information and they are descending back down to the spinal cord and to the skeletal muscle? Right, they are descending, yeah. So they will process after you receive all the information, what you need to do. The information is now coming downwards to eventually skeletal muscles. Okay, so they are not ascending. Now let's take a look at the motor pathways. So they also have motor neurons involved. Specifically, we have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Okay. So let's see. Can you identify or see the cell body of the upper motor neuron in this diagram? Right, it's right over here, right in the cerebral cortex. So it's right here, and this is the upper motor neuron. Cell body is right here, and it continues. The axon travels through a long way, go through all the segments of your regions of the brain, spinal cord. Eventually, this is in the spinal cord, that's where they meet the lower motor neuron. And the lower motor neurons will be in charge of innervating your skeletal muscles. Now, imagine if this motor neuron is damaged or not working. Will your nerve impulse be able to relay to the lower motor neuron? No, yeah. And forget about your skeletal muscle. They won't be able to get the message to contract. Yep, we'll see disease that's related to upper motor neuron in a few more slides. So right over here, I want to show you where your skeletal muscle receives their commands from. So let's start from the bottom here. So our skeletal muscle, for them to contract, they need to get the neurotransmitters from the lower motor neurons. Okay. Now, where the lower motor neurons receive their messages from, it could be from 4 different ways. So that's why it looks a little bit complex right here. But if we break it down, hopefully it won't look that bad. So first, they can receive it from the brainstem as well as the spinal cord from their local circuit neurons. Now there's a other one straight from your upper motor neurons, from your cerebral cortex, or it could be from the brainstem regions. So they can come as well. And now, also, our basal nuclei neurons can send a message, and eventually that will influence what to do downstream. And the last one is your cerebellar neurons are also involved. So these are different ways that feeds into all the information for your lower motor neurons to process. So let's take a look at 2 somatic motor pathways. We have the direct as well as the indirect motor pathway. So what these refers to is, if they are direct, they are also called pyramidal pathways. And the indirect ones are called extrapyramidal pathways. So a lot of these, for instance, they call it pyramidal pathway because they actually are from the pyramidal cells. And let's take a look at 2, for instance, direct motor pathways. So first over here, if we take a look at the direct motor pathways, we have the cortical spinal tracts. So it starts from the cerebral cortex and goes to the spinal regions. Now there is the lateral and the anterior pathways. So let's first orient ourselves, okay, from the right and left. So you're looking at a patient's, for instance, brain. This is the right side, this is the left side of the body. Okay. So this is your primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. So first, for instance, upper motor neuron cell body sends a message to the midbrain. Now, and this upper motor neuron continues to travel through the pons, and as it reaches the medulla, the pyramid cells are here. So right over here, can you see that they made a cross? This is called crossing over or decussation. Okay. So very importantly that we see this, because you probably have heard of why opposite side of the brain, like right side of the body, brain controls left side of the muscles. So this is the reason why. So actually about 90% of the neurons are going to cross over. And as they continue this lateral cortical spinal tract, eventually at the spinal cord region, that's where they meet the lower motor neurons. And then it continues to control and innervate the skeletal muscles of your distal parts of the limbs. So The reason, so 90% of those will cross over. As a result, your right side of the brain controls, for instance, majority of the left side of the muscles. Okay? Or you can say left side of the brain controls right side of the muscles. Now let's take a look at the anterior pathways. So same, from the cerebral cortex, the upper motor neuron travels down. Okay. Now this time, they go through the pons, they go through the medulla, they go through the pyramid. So it's also happening through the pyramids, but they are not crossing over here. Okay. It reaches the spinal cord and through what we call the anterior cortical spinal tract. So not on the side, but in the front. Eventually, it meets its lower motor neuron and innervates muscle, skeletal muscle of the more proximal parts of the limbs. Okay, so hopefully you can see the differences between these two and you see some similarity as well. Now let's take a look at the cortical bulbar pathway. So this actually helps you control a lot of skeletal muscle of your facial expression, skeletal muscle of your tongue. So let's follow through from the top again. So from your cerebral cortex, the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex, your upper motor neuron travels down and comes through all the way, passing the midbrain to the pons. Now, so over here, they reach out to all different brain. For instance, cranial nerves. You'll see that, for instance, 9 cranial nerves, pairs of cranial nerves are involved here. So they are really involving with a lot of facial expression, skeletal muscle in the face, as well as of the tongue. So a lot of skeletal muscle in the facial as well as head regions. Now, you might have heard of this disease called, abbreviated as ALS. It means amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So A means without. What do you think myo refers to? Right? Muscle. And trophic means nourishment. Okay. So this is a disease that relates to muscles. So let's take a look at what it means. Yeah. So it's actually a motor neuron disease. Remember, I'm going to draw out, for instance, a human in my simplified form. Remember, upper motor neuron travels all the way down and reaches the lower motor neuron, and then it controls the skeletal muscles. Now, so this is a disease where the upper motor neuron, a lot of times, they actually end up not working well. So it could be from a theory that they've seen a lot of increase of glutamate. And it could be, and these increasing amount of glutamate was hypothesized to perhaps be causing these upper motor neurons to stop functioning or to die off or so. Now, their other reason could be viral reason, infection, or injuries that causes the upper motor neuron to stop working or die off. So eventually, can the lower motor neuron receive any messages? No. And how about your skeletal muscle? No. So as a result, your skeletal muscle also stop contracting. So imagine if your muscle, without getting all the messages, it causes progressively muscle weakness as well as muscle atrophy, meaning a decrease in muscle mass, okay, when we don't use our muscles. And this disease is also known as the Lou Gehrig disease. You have a very famous um, baseball player, but with the disease, he was actually passed away at age of 37. So it's really devastating, and you probably have heard of Stephen Hawkins, and he also had the disease, and he will receive a lot of help in order to breathe, to do a lot of regular daily functions. So definitely more research need to be done to help understand what causes the disease and if there's any way of helping patients. And you probably have heard of the Ice Bucket Challenge a few months or a while ago, so it's trying to raise more awareness for people to help support this. Now let's take a look over here at the summary table. So you can see the tracks as well as the location and their functions. So it was these to help you um, generalize and summarize it. So we have the lateral as well as anterior corticospinal tracts, as well as the corticobulbar tract. Now, this last one is related to the indirect motor pathway. I was able to find this slide from more updated sources, so don't memorize this, but I just want to show you there are several different tracks for the indirect ones. They do not go through the pyramid, so it's extrapyramidal. For instance, all the tracks actually will receive information from other regions of the body. For instance, from the red nucleus, from the supracolliculus, or from the vestibular nucleus that you receive information from, for instance, balances from your inner ear. So they all come together and interact with the lower motor neurons to innervate the skeletal muscles. So over here you can see the indirect motor pathway, okay, and a more summarization. Okay. So right over here, remember our motor homunculus. Do you remember where they begin at? Primary is a sensory area or motor area? Right, motor areas for the motor neurons. So hopefully you get to see that they also aren't distributed very evenly. So a lot of control, fine control on your hands, fingertips, as well as facial regions, especially your oral area, compared to other body regions. Now let's take a look at the ending part. We'll take a look at which part of your brain will help you, for instance, influence the movement through these upper motor neurons. So earlier we saw these two regions, the basal nuclei, remember, right here, as well as the cerebellum, right here. So our basal nuclei helps it with starting, initiation, as well as termination of your body movements. And they also help us stop and suppress those unwanted movements as well. And help influence our muscle tone and other cortical function. You probably remember from Parkinson's disease, where there's a decrease in dopamine secretion and result with a lot of motor control that is more out of reach. So our cerebellum, on the other hand, help us maintain control muscles for posture as well as keeping our balances. Now, if you take a look over here, for instance, our cerebellum, and to process anything, for instance, they receive messages, they will monitor what you are trying to think. So they will, for instance, monitor those intended movements, what you want to do, and they also compare what you actually are doing. So this is what you are actually doing, okay, in terms of your muscles. So after they compare the messages from your brain and compare to what you are actually doing, then they analyze it. So over here is the integrated, okay, these two information, and they decide, okay, to help us, and they will send us back with the feedback to correct. That's a lot of these motor controls. So for instance, when you're trying to play tennis or play volleyball, just to hit that ball a little bit right at the right spots, your hands or fingers have to be positioned a little bit more. So these all come into play, all regions of the body. Now, so the last part we'll go take a look at how does your cerebrum help you analyze, store, as well as decide on some of these information. So the integrative functions of our cerebrum help us staying awake, as well as relates to when we're sleeping too. So we have about a normal, hopefully 24-hour type of day or circadian clock, biological clock. And so it's help, for instance, cycle between when we're awake versus when we're sleeping. Now, when we're awake, we actually rely heavily on this reticular activating system. So our RAS, or let me write it out, which is our reticular activating system. Remember this one from a few chapters back? So this is in our cerebral cortex. Now, when this is activated, we are awake. And to make you, for instance, to arise from a sleeping mode, for instance, you can probably use it from get signals from seeing, from eyes, or from hearing, but not so much from your olfactory receptors. Now, when we're sleeping, we have a cycle alternate between non-rapid eye movement versus rapid eye movements. So non-rapid eye movement. Okay. So NREM versus REM. So there are different stages of REM. For instance, when we first fall asleep, the first few hours is under non-rapid eye movement. Usually within, for instance, an hour or so, hopefully you will fall asleep. And then you go into the rapid eye movement. This is a lot of times where you start dreaming. And they alternate and alternate among themselves. Hopefully between the night you can get a good 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Now our learning as well as memory also is very interesting aspects of integrative functions. Definitely we have categorized memory based on, for instance, what we can remember in the short term. This could last, for instance, from seconds to minutes, such as if you're trying to memorize someone's phone number. And also, if you use it long and more repetitively, this can turn memory that lasts from days even to years. Okay, so hopefully what you're learning in AMP is going from here, and you have a technique and a way of changing them into long-term memory. Now, the slide in this last one over here shows you the reticular activating system. So right here you can see that it expands receive messages from your ears, auditory impulses receives from your eyes, but not so much from smelling. So if a person is sleeping and to wake them up, especially during a fire, it's very important to have some fire alarm also in the bedroom as well, because they may not respond from the sense of the smoke itself. Now, so all these messages come in and eventually relay the message through your thalamus to all different regions of the cortex. So this concludes our chapter 16, and we'll see you in the next video lecture or in class.